Hello, welcome to the podcast There Is No Spoon. Many people accuse Jung of being mystical and unscientific. They say that perhaps in his time, analytical psychology was a reasonable approach, better than treatments like electroshock or hydrotherapy. But today, in the age of science and progress, we have more rational models for understanding human behavior. One of the concepts that often fuels such criticism is synchronicity. You can read about it in Jung's essay titled Synchronicity, an Acausal Connecting Principle. Interestingly, after the first chapter, the misconception about Jung being purely mystical begins to fade. He provides a solid justification for his method and position, even by modern standards. But let's get back to our main topic, synchronicity. So, what is it? Jung writes, "Chance, we say, must obviously be susceptible of some causal explanation, and is only called chance, or coincidence, because its causality has not yet been discovered. Since we have an inveterate conviction of the absolute validity of causal law, we regard this explanation of chance as being quite adequate. But if the causal principle is only relatively valid, then it follows that even though in the vast majority of cases, an apparently chance series can be causally explained, there must still remain a number of cases which do not show any causal connection. Put more simply, two events in life are considered synchronous when a person perceives them as meaningfully connected, even though there's no obvious cause and effect link between them. Jung describes synchronicity as the meaningful coincidence in time of two or more events that are not causally connected, but have the same or a similar meaning. He gives the example of repeatedly encountering the same number throughout the day, on a tram ticket, a theater ticket, and a phone number. Of course, it's important to note that just because something seems like synchronicity doesn't mean it actually is. Coincidences happen. So how do we distinguish between the two? First, common sense is helpful. If the events are reasonably expected to occur, and they do, then it's likely just a coincidence. Another helpful approach is Sherlock Holmes's method: eliminate all rational explanations. Second, pay attention to the emotional response. True synchronicity tends to carry a strong emotional charge. If there's no emotion involved, it's probably just an ordinary event. Now, onto the question of causes. Let's assume we understand what synchronicity is. Then a reasonable question arises. Why not just explain everything as a coincidence? After all, any coincidence, no matter how unlikely, still has a probability, however small. Take the example of the physical constants of the universe being just right to allow not only galaxies, stars, and planets, but also life. The odds were incredibly low, yet it happened. So why bother inventing something like a causal connecting principle when we already have probability theory? This is a fair question, and I'm open to the idea that it could all just be a coincidence. But this is precisely where the dividing line lies between physics and psychology. In physics, calling something a coincidence is perfectly acceptable, and it resolves the matter. There's no issue. But psychology deals not only with objective circumstances, but also with subjective experience. For instance, someone might believe that Mercury being in retrograde affects their luck. From an astronomical point of view, this belief is nonsense, but beliefs don't have to align with physical facts. A person's worldview can be whatever they believe it to be. If they believe in retrograde Mercury, then its influence becomes a psychological fact for them. And it's important to call it a fact, even if it applies only to that individual. Coming back to synchronicity, this is why I highlighted emotional response as a second key feature. When a strong emotional reaction is present, the events and their perceived meaning matter to the person. They become connected in the person's internal worldview. And if that's the case, the connection isn't up for debate. It becomes another psychological fact. Why does this happen? Due to cognitive biases? A lack of rational thinking? Some other reason? Ultimately, that's irrelevant. What matters is that the connection exists for the person, and if it weren't important, there wouldn't be an emotional reaction. So yes, from a physics standpoint, synchronicity might not exist. But in psychology, that viewpoint doesn't matter. What matters is the psychological perspective. And from that standpoint, the answer is clear. If something exists in a person's inner world, then it does exist. I believe many listeners have experienced meaningful coincidences in their own lives, ranging from simple chance occurrences to events that seem to align magically. This is synchronicity, or at least one type of it. Let's dig a bit deeper. Let's talk about magical thinking. In episode 13, we discussed life stories and their essential features. Why bring that up here? Because one of the most important aspects of a life story is coherence. In other words, events and personal changes need to connect in a meaningful line. From episode 13, one might have assumed this coherence must always be causal and rational. But who said that's true? In reality, our minds don't always link events through logic. Of course, in hindsight, we may come up with logical explanations or convince ourselves that logic was at play, but in the moment of making decisions, that's not always the case. Which brings me to another important point. Cause and effect isn't the only type of connection we use in building our life stories. Synchronicity can be seen as one of those alternative forms of connection. In a way, synchronicity is irrational, if we define irrationality as that which doesn't rely on logic. But it's emotionally powerful, which, as we've discussed, is a hallmark of synchronicity. There's another situation where synchronicity isn't just useful, it's necessary. Sometimes people encounter absurd or disruptive events that shake their core beliefs, like their faith in a just world. Accepting randomness fully and consciously is incredibly difficult. I'm not even sure our minds are capable of tolerating chaos without resistance. If it is possible, it's likely only at a certain level of psychological development. But what about those who haven't reached that point yet? That's where synchronicity comes in. It provides a kind of bridge between different parts of a life story, using seemingly unrelated coincidences. When rational explanations aren't possible or accessible, any explanation will do. And that's where synchronicity steps in. It can take any irrational form that the individual finds acceptable. Repeated numbers, Mercury in retrograde, tarot cards, and so on. In general, I think the mechanism behind this phenomenon is actually quite understandable and reasonable for a modern person. Of course, Jung himself invested more into the idea. And you can do the same. You might even consider synchronicity not just as a coping strategy for narrative incoherence, but as a real mechanism by which events in the universe are connected. As the famous Emerald Tablet says, "That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below." But that's not essential for today's conversation. What I wanted to show in this episode is that even something as seemingly mystical as synchronicity can make perfect sense within a rational worldview. This was the podcast, There Is No Spoon. Until next time.